Hey, what's up, everyone? Welcome to the Dr. Pete Goldman Show. Welcome to my buddy, Damien Noorbakhsh in San Francisco. Damien, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much for having me.
Cool. So, Damien, obviously we've known each other for a long time, and we're both fellow martial artists, and you're also well-versed in a lot of cool topics. So, one time we were talking and you kind of told me your evolution as a martial artist, like kind of how like when you were, and of course you'll go into it, but like when you were, I think 16 or so, I'm sure you'll give the details, how you kind of had this opportunity to go to Japan and you had certain thoughts about that and then certain experiences. Then you came back to California and had other experiences. So I thought it would be cool to kind of kick it off with that. Can you talk a little bit about, when you went to Japan, how that came about, what it was like, what it led to, et cetera, et cetera?
I, like all kids growing up in the San Fernando Valley in the 80s, I got enrolled in karate. That's, if you didn't know that, that's where Karate Kid was filmed, in the San Fernando Valley. So, and at that time, mid 80s, karate was big. This, of course, was not the karate that you and I would grow up to know, but, kind of McDojo style. But regardless, we all did karate. It kind of became my obsession. By the time I was 8 years old, my parents, we moved up to a very small town on the Mendocino coast, and there was absolutely nothing going on over there. We literally lived in the woods. And the only thing that kind of kept me sane was just becoming obsessed with everything related to martial arts. And there was no schools. So this was all me getting my hands on any books, any pamphlets, any magazines, watching any movies. And, for what it's worth, just kind of figuring things out on my own.
I have a question. When you were living there and there was no dojos, but you had trained when you were a little kid, were you kind of like, in your room, kind of like doing the stuff, or was it just more like mental? You were reading about it.
I got whatever I got was from Van Damme movies or Bruce Lee movies. What I did when I was 5 years old, that didn't carry on at all.
Yeah.
So it was basically me just trying to figure stuff out on my own. And this, this obsession in martial arts kind of blossomed into an interest for everything Asian, specifically Japanese. But I really got interested in Asian philosophy, Asian culture, history. Really got obsessed with samurai culture. So by the time I was 14 or so, my dad, who was always sick and tired of hearing about my obsession with martial arts and thought it was stupid, one day, very much to my surprise, he said, "Why don't you just go to Japan?" And that was kind of coming from him. It was pretty shocking because he was very overprotective. He wouldn't even let me go to another town by myself. So for him to make this suggestion was pretty profound. And I think from his point of view, he wanted me to be a big businessman, either go into finance or go into law or whatever. And at that time in the mid 90s, Japan was still an economic powerhouse. So he figured, okay, if you're obsessed with this country and this culture, you might as well do something that's going to benefit your career in the future. From my point of view, I'm like, yeah, I'm going to go there and do martial arts.
Well, question for you.
Please.
When you before that conversation with your dad, which we'll get back to, of course, like for example, myself, when I grew up in Brooklyn, it was just at that time, it was just dangerous. Like, anyone could just look up the statistics. It was just a horribly crime-ridden place when I grew up there. So I started taking karate. I guess it was karate. It wasn't Kyokushin. I think it was like a Korean martial. I don't even know what it was. I called it karate.
We all did Tang Soo when we were kids.
Yeah, I think it was Tang Sudo or something. I don't know.
Exactly.
But I mean, it was interesting because like the guy would tell us, like, if someone tries to like abduct you, bite their ear. It was like real street fighting stuff. It had some legitimacy just because that's how Brooklyn was then. But my point is, I, as a 11-year-old or whatever I was, I had no spiritual aspirations, no Asian interest. I just wanted to learn to defend myself, not because I wanted to be a tough guy. I just wanted to be able to like walk to school without getting beaten up, pretty much. So, but it sounds like for you, even before your dad suggested you go to Japan, and you mentioned like the samurai culture and everything Asian. It sounded like even at that young age, you had like like the beginnings of some like spiritual aspirations as attached to the martial arts. I'm sure you also wanted to learn to defend yourself and fight, but it sounds like you actually innately had a draw toward that other aspect. Am I right?
Yeah, I mean, to me, I guess because I got into it at such a young age, it all seemed intertwined. These didn't seem like separate, independent components. It seemed like the philosophy or religion, if you will, was interconnected with the martial arts. And I got deep into it, and my attitude at that time, at that age, was there's something magical, like there's like some metaphysical powers connected with martial arts. And I think a lot of people that have gone off the deep end with martial arts, especially as a kid, you can't help it but have those feelings. So yeah, there was definitely that element. My mom kind of like a lot of people of her generation, was kind of a pseudo hippie. She was really into Eastern thought. I mean, no offense, but albeit on a pretty superficial level. But that was also how I got exposed to a lot of Eastern thinking at a young age. We would go to the self-realization gardens in Pacific Palisades.
It's a beautiful place, actually. Yeah.
I'm glad you've been. That place is
incredible.
amazing.
Yeah.
And we go there, and they have a little bookstore. And one of my first exposures to Buddhism was I got a comic book about the Buddha's life, and I was like 6 or 7 years old, and it just things go off in your brain. This makes sense to me. I feel a connection here. So yeah, long story short, to answer your question, it very much so felt like it was intertwined, and there was that connection.
And then when you went to Japan, which I'm sure you'll get into, was that aspect not satisfied, but was it addressed at all, or were you just kind of doing physical martial arts?
Well, so my dad made this suggestion, and by this point I was 15, and it all seemed like a totally unrealistic idea. And on top of that, there was only one exchange organization that would take a 15-year-old. The minimum age was 18 for all the other ones. So we applied. They found a family that was going to take me in Osaka. And then this is 1995. That's when the big Kobe earthquake happened. So that was off the table, because that's, basically Osaka's in Kobe area. And, it wasn't really that much of a disappointment for me, because it just seemed so unrealistic that I was going to do this. Then not that much longer after that, the organization came back and said, we actually have a family that'll host you. They live in the very southern part of the southern island. So the very southern tip of Kyushu. So, Japan has 4 islands. Honshu is the main island. There's Hokkaido in the north, Shikoku to the kind of southeast, and then Kyushu is the southern island. And I was like, sure, whatever. And they said, okay, they actually live on an active volcano. Would you be okay with that? Yeah, why not? So I ended up going to, it's called Sakurajima. It's in the very southern tip of Kyushu. It is an active volcano. In fact, they just had a huge eruption there a couple months ago. So I went and I lived with this family, the Hara family, incredible people. I'm still in contact with them today.
Hara, Hara.
That's correct. Hara.
Which of course is coincidentally or not coincidentally is like a Japanese word for something very significant.
The gut, stomach.
Yeah.
And I went to a public school on the island. And so at this point, getting back to
pause there for a second. Pause there,
please.
What did you feel like when like even let's say someone lives in one part of the U.S. and they move to another part, and it's their first, and they're in high school, and it's their first day of school. They could be nervous because they're kind of like the new kid. But this is like a whole new level. You're actually showing up at a freaking high school. You're probably the one non-Japanese kid in there. I don't think you spoke Japanese at all, or at least well. Were you kind of like that morning when you were getting ready? Were you like psyched or nervous or?
So the Hara family, my host family, they owned one of the local gas stations on the island, and they had, by Japanese standards, a pretty big, nice house, which was 2 floors. So I shared a room with my host brother Kenta, and our bedroom faced Kinko Bay, that's Kagoshima Bay, and there was a balcony that looked over to the street. that morning I wake up and Kenta, my host brother, he's like, go look outside. And I had been studying Japanese, but I couldn't speak a word of it. It's totally different trying to study out of a book. So he's like, oh, go look, go look. So I open up the drapes to the balcony, and there was about 15 of the girls from the school all waving at me. And I was like, oh, fuck, this is going to be a good trip.
Surprised you ever came home.
With that being said, that area of Japan is very provincial. A lot of people on that island had actually never seen a foreigner, believe it or not, even in 1995. That's how kind of rural it was. So to answer your question, it was surrealistic for me. I didn't feel any type of nervousness. It felt I don't want to get too weird or whatever, but it felt like something entered my body and I became a different person. And I had complete confidence. It felt like this is destiny, or I don't want to start sounding too hokey, but I did not feel nervous at all. It felt like
how long were you there until you started actually doing martial arts with someone?
So I wanted to do K1. I was watching K1 on TV. K1 was playing live in this house. This is what I wanted to do, but my host family, they all did Shorinji Kempo. And there was a Shorinji Kempo dojo on the island. I didn't really want to do that, but obviously out of respect for my host family.
But just to pause for a second, even though you knew about K1, which of course had its original origins in Seido, Kaikan, and then which came from Ashihara, which came from Kyokushin. But if I'm not mistaken, the style you just mentioned, it's kind of like they have like stand-up locks, like kind of like jiu-jitsu, it's like locks.
Shorinji,
and decent fighting. So it actually seems like I don't know much about it, but it seems like not horrible, right?
Shorinji Kempo is the Japanese word for Shaolin Kung Fu or Shaolin Kempo. Shorinji is the Japanese word of Shaolin. It's registered in Japan as a religious organization. I'm not knocking any martial art at all. Every martial art has its purpose, and there's people that are going to find really great value from it. At 15, that really wasn't the style for me. I wanted to do something else. It just wasn't available to me at the time. But I was watching K1. I was also watching, like, randomly, there would be like the Sabaki challenge on this Japanese TV. When I was 13, I spent a summer in Denver, and I trained, again, going back to Korean stuff. I did Taekwondo, which was the only thing that was close by my grandma's house where we were staying. But that was Tiger Kim's Taekwondo, which is where Pat Smith trained from. So I would, I was like, oh, I kind of have a connection here. I watched Pat Smith fight in Sabaki, or then later he fought in K1. But K1 that style was where my heart was. Like, this is what I want to do.
So for those who don't know, I just want to add that 1995 and K1 was a spectacular era. You had Peter Arts, Ernesto Hoos, Jerome LeBanner, Mike Bernardo, and many Andy Hug,
Hoog.
Hug. That was for you, by the way. But just an amazing. It was such really the entire existence of K1
that was the golden era.
But that was the goal. I mean, such great, and Stan the Man was in there.
One of my favorites.
And I think anyway, there's a few other really great ones. So you really were in Japan at a great time when it comes to like that K1 world.
Right. So as far as martial arts went, I didn't get the fantasy martial arts experience that I wanted. But that trip really changed my life. And I think that goes without saying. I do want to say that really quick. I want to interject. When I got there, initially, I was very disappointed because I looked around and I'm like, hey, this doesn't look like what I thought Japan was going to look like. Where's the castles? Where's the Zen gardens? Obviously, that was a very ignorant, attitude I had. I really lucked out because that area of Japan is probably the most samurai influenced area of Japan. That's where basically the Meiji Revolution, which took Japan from the feudal era to the modern era. It all took place exactly there in Kagoshima, where I was living. Saigo Takamori is kind of the hero of modern Japan. If you've seen the Tom Cruise movie, The Last Samurai, the Japanese character is based off of Saigo Takamori, who's from Kagoshima, where I was living.
Is that movie, if I'm not mistaken, was based on a French soldier in real life? Am I correct?
I think it was a hybrid composite.
Yeah. Okay.
I wasn't really paying attention to Tom Cruise, but in any event,
actually, by the way, my teacher, Soshio Oyama, I love that movie, which I thought was interesting.
Well, mention Saigo Takamori and he'll know exactly.
Well, he's not alive anymore,
that's true.
But he did he loved that movie, and I was just I mean, I wasn't shy. I just thought to him would be kind of like an Americanized movie, but he loved it. So anyway.
Cool. So the one thing that Kagoshima was famous for, a lot of things. It's famous for its alcohol, Satsuma Shochu, which is it's like a mix between vodka and sake. It's the sweet potato, which grows there, mixed with rice. It's very strong, kind of has almost like a tequila type smell. Satsuma oranges. You know what a Satsuma orange is, right?
No, tell me what is that?
You know, the little oranges.
Yeah.
That's from that region, Satsuma. As far as martial arts go, though, the native local Kenjutsu style is called Jigen-ryu. So Jigen-ryu, actually in Kyokushin, we say Ichigeki Histatsu, right? One strike, one kill. Ichigeki Histatsu came from Jigen-ryu. Jigen, it's one strike only. It's totally different than all other styles of Japanese swordsmanship. There's no bowing. There's no defense. It's one strike. Either you kill the guy or you're dead. And so some people will argue with me, but I think Masayama was very much influenced by Jigen-ryu. Not their technique, obviously, because it's karate versus swordsmanship, but in the attitude. It's all or nothing, one strike. That's the martial arts style of Kagoshima. And they still have the dojo there in Kagoshima City, which is, I don't know how many generations of masters, but it's been a continuous stream of masters from the founding of the style. It was my dream that I would, come back to the US for 1 year, go back there and learn Jigen-ryu, that style of swordsmanship. So 1 year.
You almost sound like you became a modern day Don Draeger. Are you familiar with him?
Oh, of course, I read it. Yeah,
because I've
read a lot of his books.
Yeah, he was an American. For those who don't know, he was an American guy. He moved to Japan. I believe he eventually spoke fluently. He became like a real legit expert on several Japanese weapon-based martial arts. I think some Japanese jiu-jitsu. I'm not 100% sure. I know he was friends with Masayama. I don't think he trained in Kyokushin, but they were on good terms. They respected each other. So it sounded like you were almost going to go down.
If I'm not mistaken, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think he was one of the coordinators for that James Bond movie, You Only Live Twice.
I don't know that, but I would believe that. He was also good friends with John Blooming, who was a famous, judo and Kyokushin guy. Yeah.
So just really quick, that movie, You Only Live Twice, when James Bond goes to train with the ninjas, those were all Kyokushin guys, by the way. I don't know if you knew that. And
I know that Sean Connery, came to the headquarters and was hosted by Masayama.
That was during this time. Yeah. And that movie was actually shot in Kagoshima, which blew my mind. I didn't realize that till after I lived there. But he's going in and out of the volcano, all that shot in that area where I lived. So that trip was a really amazing experience. Going back to your question, did I fulfill my martial arts, whatever, while I was there? Not specifically as to what I wanted to do, but it opened my mind and opened my, obviously made me realize there's so much more out there that I was.
Were you like, as a kid that age, were you the kind of kid that felt like if you were bothered or bullied or attacked, did you just feel like, well, I'm kind of a tough kid anyway, I don't really need martial arts?
I was bullied a lot. And it wasn't that I couldn't defend myself or that I didn't want to defend myself. My dad was so strict and was such a disciplinarian that the idea of me getting in trouble at school, that wasn't going to happen. So the few times that I did defend myself, legitimately defend myself, and got in trouble, he kicked the shit out of me. And so I was more afraid of getting in trouble with my dad because I didn't want to get in trouble at school. And I basically became
So
a target.
you didn't feel physically intimidated by the so-called bullies. You just felt like you were in a bad position because you couldn't really respond to it.
And it was, it kind of messed me up, to be honest. It kind of developed a complex where, and when you become a target of bullying, everybody is like open game, open season. Especially when we were living up north, where it was kind of a rough group of people up there. You had some real rednecks, and I don't mean like rednecks that drive, go to the rodeo on the weekend. I mean people who log and fish for a living, and family connections are a little questionable. So there was rednecks. We lived near an Indian reservation. Those were rough people, and I was basically the rich city kid, even though we weren't rich by any standards, but I became an easy target for bullying, and because I wouldn't fight back, it made it even better for the bullies. So I don't know if that answers your question, but that was
that does. When you kind of started learning how to fight, I guess we're fast forwarding a little bit, but when you started learning how to fight, did that make you feel kind of more secure just being wherever you were, or you just kind of just were back to that original pre-Japan trip? Like, I just love this. I'm finally learning martial arts.
In that trip to Japan, where I was technically by myself, that's where I blossomed, and I started, as weird as this sounds, I was able to fight. It felt so liberating. Like, I started getting into street fights, and
in Japan. Now,
And
how did the street fights develop in Japan? Was that based on the fact that you weren't Japanese?
Yeah. So the first month that I was there in school, I was treated like a celebrity. That morning I told you, with the girls all underneath my balcony, the first month or so, everybody treated me like that. Not just the other students, but the faculty, the teachers. And then after about a month, basically their attitude was, you're here to teach us about cool American stuff, teach us to speak English, teach us cool ways to dress. And I was like, no. I'm here to learn about you guys. I'm here to learn your language. I'm here to learn your culture. And they could not understand this. They couldn't understand it, and they couldn't accept it. Not just the students, the faculty, the teachers. And I started having a lot of problems. At first I thought it was super cool because I had a book on Japanese etiquette, and it was talking about uchi to soto, in and out, and the whole dynamics of the Japanese group, which is extremely complex on all levels. And they were doing to me what I was reading in the book, that you're not part of the group, so you can't participate. And at first I thought it was like a cool, experiment that I was getting to witness in real time. But after a while, it got old really quick, especially when the teachers were doing the same thing to me. They would ignore me. And after about 3 months or so, this is when I started getting into a lot of fights at school. And that was just me being frustrated, and me basically standing up to the guys that were talking shit to me. And again, going back to the freedom of being able to fight. As the one day, one of like the top guys in the class kind of got in my face, and I just laid him out. And it felt amazing. Like, I was like, wow, I never thought I'd be able to do that. It reminded me.
But just so I understand, you did that based on instinct, right? You were not really trained at that point.
Not really, no. I mean, I was doing martial arts, but it wasn't like.
And then I have a question. When you went back to your host family, were the parents like not even aware of it, or were they like, hey,
oh
man?
No, they were like, awesome.
Oh, they're like,
awesome. Yeah. That's that region of Japan. They're fighters.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember I read Catcher in the Rye, and there's a scene, there's a part in Catcher in the Rye where he talks about, and I'm paraphrasing, but he talks about it'd be way easier to kill somebody than to fight them, because he was so afraid of hitting somebody in the face. Are you familiar with that?
Well, first of all, I read the book, but when I read the book, I think I was probably about 14. And for
Right.
some reason, I don't remember like that exact part, but I did
So
read it.
that part stuck out in my mind because I always had this weird thing about touching somebody else's face. I don't know where that came from, but the minute this like second that I hit that dude in the face, it was like, oh, I'm free. I
It's
don't
funny.
have this limitation.
I actually had
So yeah, so basically, long story short, um, after 3 months of being there, I was ready to go home. I said, basically, F these people. This is a messed up culture. This isn't what I expected. I had a horrible opinion of the Japanese and Japan.
but again, just to be clear, in those 3 months or however long you ended up being there, no martial arts training.
No, I was doing Shorinji Kempo.
Oh, you did
Yeah,
go there. Okay, got it.
but I mean, no disrespect to Shorinji Kempo again, but that wasn't exactly teaching me,
Did
some
you
bad
did you feel that
skills.
the locks, just out of curiosity, were the locks worthwhile, or that's just kind of
Mm,
a fantasy world kind of?
they didn't do one of the main things is they didn't do live sparring, so it was
Okay,
all just
it's hard to tell. It's hard to tell.
you
Okay,
grab my wrist and I'm going to twist you and you're going to fall down, and that was kind of their thing. Everything
got
was
it.
pretty much set forms.
Hmm.
But anyway, I had a meeting. I told my parents like, hey, I want to come back. They called the organization. The organization had a meeting with the principal. So we all, I had a meeting with the principal and the teachers, and they said, hey, look, what you're going through is not unique to you. It's not even unique to the fact that you're a foreigner. Basically, why you're having problems with your schoolmates and with the teachers, this is really kind of old school, old style Japan. Your ranking in the class hasn't been determined, so people don't know how to deal with you. And I said, what are you talking about? And the principal starts explaining that in the class there's like a hierarchy. There's the number one guy, there's his lieutenants, and there's everybody else underneath. And for the others, for your schoolmates and for the teachers to treat you appropriately, you need to determine where you are in this little power pyramid. And I'm listening to this, I'm like, holy shit, this is like a Yakuza movie.
And
This
then
is the
this guy, they're obviously fluent in English. Yeah, they're speaking English.
the English teacher was, and she would obviously translate. Um, and I got super pumped up because I'm like, this is like a real life mafia movie that I gotta, you know. And they said it's not. This is how it would be if a student from another prefecture came here, even a Japanese person. They need to have their position determined. And I'm like, well, how do you do that? And they're like, well, you got to fight somebody, and whoever you fight, that determines your position in this pyramid. So the number one in the class was a guy named Ikihara, and he was the captain of the soccer team. So this school had like the top soccer team in the area. And I was like, well, I'm going to fight Ikihara, and I'm going to be number one. And they say, okay, hold on. You're not listening to what we're saying. These kids, they've all been going to school since they were 4 or 5 years old. This class structure was determined literally at that time. You're only going to be here for a few more months. If you fight the number one guy and you knock him off, that's gonna screw up the whole power dynamic of these people's concept of who they are and where they belong. And at that point, I'm like, I don't care. I want to be number one. So word got around that I wanted to fight Ikihara, and the next day I show up and I'm ready to go. I spent the morning stretching and doing my kicks and everything else. So I get to school. Ikehata and his guys walk up, and he's like, "Come over here. I want to talk to you." And I'm ready to go, right? And he's like, "I'm going to make you a deal. You're going to be shadow number one." And I'm like, "What does that mean?" He's
So he
like,
speaks English. He speaks
"No,
English.
no, no. My Japanese was getting pretty good by this point.
Okay, okay, got it, got it.
I mean, I was there to learn. I was there to learn Japanese, except for the English teacher and my host mother's brother. Nobody spoke English.
Okay, so this guy's speaking Japanese to you, and he's saying you're going to be shadow number one, and
Right.
you're following him. Okay, got it.
Yeah. And I'm like, so what does that mean? He's like, same status. We don't have to fight. And literally from there, everything changed. Everybody was normal with me. Everything was harmonious. And I was like, wow, that's that's how serious these people take their positions in their groups. Um,
Do you think that, by the way, I'm just completely guessing, and I don't even know if you know the answer, but I'll ask you. It sounds a little bit like some Hawaiian high schools. Now, obviously, there's a lot of Japanese people in Hawaii. Do you think that culture you're just explaining for the last few minutes worked its way into the
mm,
Hawaiian culture? Or you just think it's coincidence they do what they
I
do? And
think I think that's kind of I don't want to say primitive. I don't even want to say tribal, but I think that that's kind of an old style way of doing things, that cultures that are probably more in touch with, you know, their cultural roots, that's probably what they practice. So maybe it's exacerbated in a country like Japan, but I don't think it's anything that unique. It would be no go in America or probably a Western European country, but probably a more kind of old school cultures, you see something similar.
Okay. So at that point, once you had that meeting with him, until you left Japan, things were pretty calm.
It was great. Yeah, it was great. You know.
Okay. And then your time ended there. It was time to go back to the US.
Yeah. So that was Christmas. I came back Christmas 95. So it was almost 96. Not that long after that, my parents split up. My dad and I, we moved to San Francisco. He wanted to move to Palo Alto because, again, he had the bright idea that I was going to go to Stanford and be a big business dude. I said, no, let's go to San Francisco so I can do karate.
How are you aware? How are you aware that there was karate in San Francisco? How'd you know?
We always went to San Francisco a lot. Even when we lived in Los Angeles, my parents loved San Francisco, so we would go there really quite often, every couple of months at least. And I would go to Chinatown, I go to Japantown. We would drive by all the neighborhoods, and I'd see, all the martial arts schools. To me, I always had an impression like San Francisco was a real like martial arts city, which it is, or it was at least. So we moved to San Francisco. We moved to Japantown, and there actually was a Shorinji Kempo school in Japan, still is in Japantown. And I kind of felt maybe a little like an obligation to keep training for whatever reason, even though I didn't really feel connected to that style. So I started training there, but I got a job in Japantown at a video store, which was totally inappropriate for a 16-year-old. That was like basically a Japanese porno shop. Like literally 3/4 of the store was porn. And here I am, the 16-year-old kid working here. So 3/4
But you spoke Japanese. They were impressed.
Oh, the owners loved me. It was Japanese owners, all Japanese coworkers, and they were like, who is this weird, cool, random kid who speaks Japanese, is into all this stuff? So I started working there. So 3/4 was porn, but the other stuff, they had a big martial arts section. So I would, every day when I worked, it would be K1 or Kyokushin tournaments.
Were these in VHS tapes?
Of course, yeah.
Because it's interesting because
96, dude.
Yeah. I remember I think it was around 97, 98. And I was living in Manhattan. I was living in Manhattan, and I used to go to the Japanese video stores
for porn.
And actually the ones I went to, they either didn't have porn or I didn't notice it, but they certainly had some great K1, and they were really up to date. I have to give them credit.
Right.
Like I would see when it would happen, and they were just there. Like I was like, how did you get this on your shelf? And I would, it was really good. I'd borrow it, I'd go home and watch it, bring it back. Right. So I was like fully up to date on the K1 stuff.
So yeah, I was, we had a TV.
By the way, I just want to interject one thing. Believe it or not, I don't think I ever told you this, but believe it or not, in 1992, before the first K1, Master Ichi, when he was going to make the first K1, called my teacher to see if he wanted to send anyone. So my teacher said to me, look, we have a year, you're really good at, this kind of fighting. We're just going to go to like boxing gyms, and we're going to tune you up a little bit so you're ready for K1. Right. And he said, it's $100,000 prize, which it was. He said, if you win, you can keep 50,000. I'll keep 50,000. So I said, maybe I'll do that. Now the funny thing is, my dad was not particularly overprotective, as you mentioned. Your dad was. I'd say he was like average, Okay. But I remember my dad was always, whatever I wanted to do was like, yeah, great. Whatever I told him I was going to do, he supported. I said, Dad, there's this thing in Japan, and I told him about the K1. He's like, no, you're not doing that. No. No. And actually, when I watched that first K1, of course, I would have got annihilated. So I'm glad I didn't. But believe it or not, I was actually asked to be in the first K1 by my teacher. So
interesting. So, I'm playing these tapes because we had a TV in the video store, and the other guys working there were like, dude, you're obsessed with this stuff. You need to meet Yamaguchi. And I'm like, who's Yamaguchi? They're like, he's a guy I used to work here. He does this stuff. I'm like, call him up. What the hell? So one day, this guy walks into the video store. probably the buffest Japanese dude I've ever met. Pretty tall, also.
Not,
like,
it's not a buff culture.
it's not tall.
I guess it's a genetic thing. I don't know.
Dude, so he's like 6 foot, long hair down to his shoulders. I mean, buff. And he's like, "Are you the kid?" And I'm like, "Who are you?" He's like, "I'm Yamaguchi." I'm like, "Oh, yeah, yeah." So he's like, we're doing Seito Kaikon, which is, Ishii's style. We're doing it. There's a guy who's a brown belt in Seito Kaikon who's kind of it's a club basically. But he's like, "You're too young. You can't. I'm sorry. I came over here because these guys said you wanted to meet me, but you're too young. You're too small." I'm like, "No, no, 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 no. I can do it. Watch." And I started doing all my kicks in the air. And he was like, "Okay, all right. You got some nice kicks. You're enthusiastic."
Now, this guy Yamaguchi, he was also pretty good, or he just was big, but more of a beginner.
He was good. Yeah, he was good.
Oh, so he wasn't the brown. He was below the brown belt instructor,
right?
But he was still good.
He was still good. So he's like, "Well, we actually train in Oakland. We train at the Gold's Gym over there. How would you get over there?" I don't know. I'm 16. He's like, "Well, I could give you a ride on my motorcycle, but I'm gonna have to meet your dad first and get permission." And I'm like, "Okay, that's respectful and that's a good sign." So I go and I tell my dad. My dad's like, "Holy fuck, you're still into this stuff?" Yes. So it's like, "This guy wants to come by, to meet you, see if it's cool if I train." He's like, "All right, whatever." So I think Yamaguchi-san was supposed to come by like 8 o'clock that night or something. And in our building, we had a lobby. My dad and I were waiting, 8:30, 9 o'clock, never shows up. And my dad's like, "Yeah, so much for your martial arts friends." So we go back to the apartment and I'm like, "Man, that really looks bad." So it's like 1:30 in the morning. Obviously, I'm asleep. The phone rings. I'm like, "Who the hell's calling me at 1:30 in the morning?" And hello? He's like, "Hey, Damien, this is Tai Yamaguchi. Hey, man, I'm really sorry." I'm like, "Dude, it's 1:30 in the morning." He's like, "Yeah, man, I was on my way to get you and I got in a motorcycle accident. I'm in the hospital, but I just don't want your dad to think that I flaked on you guys."
That's extra responsible.
And I'm like, "Holy shit, what an amazing person." I'm like, "Are you okay?" He's like, I'm okay. So obviously my dad was like impressed. And it turned out that all these guys that were doing karate, they were going to Oakland, but they all lived near Japantown. And in our building, we had like a little aerobics room. So I said, "Hey, if you guys all live here, why don't we just train at my place?" And they're like, "That's way better for us." So there was about a half dozen of us. They were all Japanese guys. The brown belt, his name was Arnie. He was actually half German, half Japanese.
Like Sodwell, right? Sodwell?
No. That was another Seito Kaikon guy.
Right.
Arnie Selwadel was Austrian or German, I think, or Swiss. But this is Ernie, not Arnie.
Okay.
Ernie Mayer, who also coincidentally had fought in Sabaki one year. I think he got knocked out by Rafael Linares, if that name rings a bell.
I don't know that guy.
One of the more competitive fighters in Sabaki at the time. But either way, we're training, and they beat the shit out of me. I mean, they did not hold back. And it was, looking back, that was really hard training. Every time we trained, first half would be intense pads, and then the next half would be hard sparring. And they did not go easy on me. But that made me tough, and it made me have to learn quick to survive, basically, and train with them. And then about, I would say, a year and a half later, that's when we heard that there was a real Japanese karate guy that came to the city, and that was Tomiyama Sensei. Tomiyama Sensei had been, I think, 92 Sabaki middleweight champion. And we're talking about Inshin karate by this point. He was the branch chief of Tokyo, the Tokyo Inshin karate, and then just decided he wanted to move to San Francisco and started Inshin dojo there. So our little club, our Seito Kaikon club, we all joined with Tomiyama Sensei. And that was the beginning of Inshin karate San Francisco.
So for example, there's a lot of components of what you just said, the last part. So Sensei Tomiyama got, like, he's starting a dojo. He got like 8 built-in students day one, which is pretty cool.
Good ones too.
Right. B, they were experienced. And C, he actually had some decent training partners, because if he showed up with a bunch of white belts, he'd have to kind of like bring them up for a certain amount of time, hoping he wouldn't get so rusty. So he actually got to have some decent fighting. I'm thinking from day one with this brown belt, and
some of those guys were good. So Ernie the brown belt kind of, I don't know what happened with him. He kind of fell out, but Yamaguchi-san, the guy who introduced me, he joined with Tomiyama Sensei. We had a guy named Kinya-san. The guy was huge, but not even by Japanese standards. It turned out that his aunt had been a professional wrestler in Japan, so he just had these like weird big genetics. I think he played rugby also. So we had Kinya-san, Yamaguchi-san, this little dude named Yamasaki who was really tough.
So I have a question. When they came into Sensei Tomiyama, was their attitude like, well, good, this guy is awesome, we're gonna, of course, they're hard with them, we're gonna learn? Or
there was no, it was very clear from the very beginning, this guy's the real deal. We're tough, we're big, but this guy's the real deal. So
got it.
There was no issues whatsoever.
Okay. And then how long did that core group, those 8 guys, Yamaguchi, etc., how long did they stick around the Tomiyama dojo?
So Kenya had to go back to Japan. Another Japanese dude named Joe Ogata, super smart guy. I think he actually he went back to Japan to work for Minami Nihon, one of the bigger newspapers. Super smart guy. He left. Yamaguchi-san stuck around for a while. He fought in one of the tournaments that we all did, one of the Seattle Sabakis. But people, how a dojo works, people come and go. But I think I was like the only original one that stuck.
So when you found Tomiyama dojo and you were like, finally, like for the Japan trip, the Shoin-ryu or whatever it's called, and then these guys who were kind of beating you up, and then you're like, wow, I actually have like a legit sensei. I have a actual legit sensei who I can really learn from, who's really good. He's not going anywhere. I'm in. Is that kind of what
honestly, I still wanted to do K1, but there was no like that type of kickboxing going on. Second to K1, I really wanted to do Kyokushin. In all honesty, I wasn't the biggest fan of Inshin, even though Inshin is very close to Kyokushin. I didn't like the grabbing, I didn't like the sweeping. But Tomiyama Sensei, who started off as Kyokushin, this is about as close to Kyokushin as I could find, and we got along really well.
Why did you not like, just wondering, why did you not like the grabbing and the sweeping? I'm not saying I like it. I'm just wondering why you didn't like it.
I don't know. I just felt like this is about punching and kicking and kneeing, and I didn't like the extra stuff.
Okay, fair enough.
If that makes any sense.
Yeah. So, and how about the throws? Like, did you think it was worthwhile to like throw someone? Kind of.
Not really. No.
Okay, got it. Okay.
My style became like kind of the anti-Sabaki style, where I would figure out ways to shut down people being able to sweep me and stuff. Which I kind of learned that from going back to Arnie Sobodel, because he would fight in Sabaki and he would do the same thing. And I was like, that's kind of my style right there. So I'm going to kind of mimic this guy.
I feel like when I spar with Enshin guys who are good at the throws, I feel like I inadvertently do the same thing. I kind of stop them from doing that to me.
Right.
So I'm with you on that.
Okay. But so we were training.
I just want to add, sorry about that. I feel like if you're good at clinching, it stops it. Like I feel like even when someone's good starts kind of pulling my sleeve, if I get the tie clinch on them, which in Oyama karate we were very involved with, I feel like it just like stops it.
Yeah.
I mean, listen, I'm sure someone could sweep me. I'm just saying, like in general, I feel like it helps a lot.
So, my main training partner who joined us not that long after this time period was Russian Mike Lipyansky, who would go on to be the first non-Japanese to win the Japanese Sabaki Challenge as a heavyweight.
Did he join as a white belt, or he had some experience before?
He did some like traditional karate, but not full contact.
Got it.
But he had some judo in his background, so he loved that style. He loved the grabbing. He loved the throws. super annoying to spar with him, not only because he's big and Russian and tough, but good at throws. But that became Russian Mike and I. We became kind of like the fighters of the dojo, and we fought in, I'd say, a good number of tournaments. But when you're young and you're training, you want to fight all the time, and full contact style, it would be literally like once a year, and it's just like, dude, it's hard to stay motivated when you're training 12 months out for a fight. And making reference to your interview with Nicholas Pettis, judging's not so fair in karate, especially we fought a few times in Japan, and it's demoralizing when you train for that long and that hard. You're training as a professional fighter. I don't care what anybody says about full contact karate. You're training like a professional fighter. You're not getting paid, and then you get screwed up judging on top of that, and it's demoralizing. It doesn't
actually
make you want to continue doing it.
Totally. I was never. I mean, first of all, I'm quite familiar with the judging issues in full contact karate, and it's actually been discussed on a couple episodes of this show. I never really suffered. I never really had terrible judging that I experienced. But I will say this about wanting to fight a lot. I remember when I was about, I must have been about 23 or 24, and I was fighting, Oyama, we had a lot of tournaments, so I could fight like 4 times a year. But I remember saying to Frank Clark, do you know who Frank Clark is? He was in Fighting Black Kings. He was the one white dude in Fighting Black Kings.
Oh, okay. I know who you're talking about.
So I mean, he took 8th place in the first World Open with a broken hand. He broke his hand in the board breaking. His best thing was his right punch. He was completely broken. Right. He fought in the World Open with 3 limbs, and he got speaking of terrible judging, he kicked Oishi's ass, and Oishi was like destroyed. They still gave it to Oishi, right? And then Oishi he went to the hospital. The next guy he fought won on default. So really, he should have been like top 4 in the first World Open with one hand. So He was amazing. Matter of fact, when Willie Williams was in his prime, and that was a scary dude, one of the only guys that can go toe to toe with him in the dojo was Frank Clark, who was half his size. But anyway, he became he was like our teacher's like assistant. So for the fight team, which I was on, he was kind of our coach. And I remember saying to him, I said, I'm only fighting 4 times a year. I said, and I was in Manhattan. I go, can't we just go to Chinatown and just like, can we just dojo storm? I told him, can't we just dojo storm like all the Kung Fu schools? Can I just fight all their guys? And he was like, no.
It's
not good. I know the feeling. Yeah.
So, I wanted to fight. And when I was 21, that was 2001. I got a job working for Alex Gong at the San Francisco Fairtex.
What did Sensei Tomoyama think about that?
He had no issues.
Okay, because I mean, you were training at a stand-up school, which is his,
right?
And then you were essentially going to train at another stand-up school. He just didn't care.
He had no issues, and I was always totally honest and upfront. And I mean, he had done the same thing when he was younger. He experimented with different styles. He was Kyokushin, but he started training Mumun Kai. I think that's the name.
That's like where they use like the one punch.
That's the Ichigeki one punch.
Yeah.
So he's like, hey, you want to train martial arts? That's good. There's stuff that you can learn here that you can't learn there, and et cetera, et cetera. It's no ego or personal thing, which obviously a lot of martial arts people, they get butthurt about that, but there was never an issue with him.
So before we get to the Fairtex, I don't know if Sensei Tomoyama ever mentioned this to you, but I'm just wondering, he was Kyokushin, then he moved over to Enshin. Is it because he did like the throws, or?
Yeah, he has a judo background also. And not just that, I mean, Nanomiya Kancho, the founder of Enshin, he was, basically a rock star celebrity of Kyokushin during that time period that Tomoyama Sensei was, impressionable. So I think the idea of joining his kind of idol, his hero, joining his group and doing his style, that had a lot to do with it also. And I totally get that. If Andy Hoog was alive and had a dojo, whose dojo do you think I'd want to belong to?
I got it. Yeah.
So I think there's a lot of that element there too.
Okay. And then, so what happened when you got to Fairtex? What was that like?
Yeah. So worked for the late, great Alex Gong. And at that point, I really wasn't a fan of Muay Thai, but I wanted to fight kickboxing, so that was obviously the closest thing. And
why weren't you a fan of it? Because you actively disliked part of it, or you just weren't familiar with it?
I like K1 style, which is basically no clinches, no clinching. I never really liked clinching. In a real fight, obviously, it's extremely important. For that style of fighting aesthetically, I liked the K1 style, which is limited touching the head and more or less just, kicks and punches.
I remember in the Oyama tournaments, which were really, I mean, I fought in an era would just, if you watch any of the videos of that era, that was some very high level fighters that showed up for those. But the thing I always remember when they had the rules meeting, it was so like they just could not decide on the freaking grab. Like you go to one rules meeting, like, oh, you can grab for 3 seconds.
Right.
It's kind of like, well, you grab for 1 second. You can grab, you can knee the guy in the face, but you can just grab for a second. And like whatever they said at the rules meeting was not what was enforced by the referees during the tournament.
Yeah. So of course.
I was like, why is it so hard to make a rule about grabbing? It just seems pretty simplistic.
Well, I mean, going back to, anybody who's not trained Kyokushin style, they look at Kyokushin like this is retarded. This is useless. You don't punch the face. And you have to start explaining to them the logic behind it and the reason why. And I do think that I think Masayama was a genius in many aspects and respects. But, eliminating the face punch, not only did you have a distinct style, which he could say, this is my style, but, having done both kickboxing and karate, you do save a lot of brain cells by not getting hit in the face, obviously. So, you do add to the overall longevity of your customers, for lack of a better way of putting it, that they can train super hard. You can train super hard in Kyokushin. You can beat the shit out of your body, but your head is more or less intact. Obviously, it's not good to get kicked or kneed in the face, but it's way better, in my opinion, to get kicked once in the head than get punched, 500 times in a similar amount of time.
I'm with you.
And I think
I felt like in my dojo, when the sparring was very hard in my dojo, and I felt like every class I would just kind of look to the right or left of me, and I saw someone was knocked out. So a lot of people were getting kicked in the head, but you're right. It's like that kick for that week or that month.
Boxing sparring is way different.
I agree.
And so I think that kind of extended to the whole idea of clinching. By the time Ishii made, the K1, and this was kind of there was kind of the whole phenomena of Dutch kickboxing was kind of happening simultaneously, and I think they all kind of agreed that we need to have a distinct style. It's not karate, it's not Muay Thai, it's not whatever American, late kick above the waist karate, whatever that nonsense is. This is our distinct style. And to make it distinct, we have to either have or eliminate certain things. And by having the clinch, that makes it too close to Muay Thai. So I think that's kind of where that strategy and idea came from. Not to mention the fact that, even though there wasn't many big Thai guys, none at all really, that were competitive, that could fight at a K1 heavyweight size, we still don't want some guy to come in here and just manhandle everybody because nobody does clinch. Is all this making sense?
100%. What was kind of your next step after your time at Fairtex? What was part of your martial art journey?
Yeah, so I started doing Muay Thai. Started fighting Muay Thai. I didn't have that many fights, but I had a few, and I did all right. I thought naively that, oh, this is easy. All I got to do is just keep my hands up and just fight the way I know how to fight. Obviously, there's a lot more to it than that, and I had to change my footwork and my stance and timing and everything else. But I think I fought kind of in what I would say would be a Dutch style, which a lot of the guys that I trained with and fought against just didn't. They only knew kind of Muay Thai style. So I did all right. I think the biggest issue was cutting weight, and that was the polar opposite to fighting karate. In karate, you're always trying to get bigger. If there were weight classes, you only had 3 weight classes: small, middle, heavy.
Well, so, I guess everyone has their own experience. I was always cutting weight because I fought at 174 which is really light for me because now I weigh 210 and I'm the same height, and I'm not, I'm not fat. So I really had to cut a lot of weight. So I was always losing weight.
At the top of the lightweights.
Yeah, because middleweight, hit the top of the middleweight, because the lightweights were up to 155, middleweights were up to 175. So I fought 174. I walked around at like 188.
Okay.
So if I weighed in 176 or above, I was heavyweight, but everyone in heavyweight was like 215, 220, something bigger. Kind of unlimited. So it only made sense for me to cut weight, which I did for all those years. And of course, as you know, you weigh in that morning. It's not like you weigh in 24 hours before.
You don't have a chance to rehydrate.
Yeah. So I, it was a different kind of cut, and I always did it, but I got used to it. I mean, it was all right.
Yeah. So that's really what I had the hardest time with, because when I was in super duper good shape during that time period, this is like mid-20s or so, my mid-20s to late 20s, I would walk around about 190 and then fight at 165. And I was having a really difficult time. And, the better you get, the better guys you're fighting, they all start to have a similar body shape, which is really tall and really lanky. And I'm just this short guy with short arms. And, no excuses, but it got to the point where I'm like, either I need to take this on as a professional career or just have fun, just being in shape. Because I couldn't train that much and cut weight and be competitive. And it's a bad excuse, but that's my excuse. But my heart was still in karate.
Did Sensei Tomiyama ever corner you in any of the Thai fights?
No.
Or did he come watch?
He watched a couple, yeah.
Okay. Cool.
But
so what was after that? What was after your Thai boxing era?
That was about it for me. I didn't really, I didn't really have that long of a fight career. It was around this time that my good friend Darren Uenoyama, who you're friends with, his MMA career was really starting to pick up. And whatever I had to offer at whatever humble level that is, I would help him train. And I cornered a few of his bigger fights, which were all really cool, and those were all really awesome adventures and experiences.
No, I find pretty cool, actually. I'm sure you found the same thing. When you're from the Kyokushin lineage at a high level, like whether it's, Kyokushin or Seito Kaikan or Enshin or whatever, or Oyama Karate, there are just things that are taught in the high level Kyokushin lineage that a lot of high level pro fighters don't know. And when you said that, you gave whatever you had to offer, it's actually a lot, because even guys who are good boxers or good, here and there, Kyokushin's got some really unique stuff, and all the offshoots of it have really unique stuff.
Well, and I think it's not just that. It's, MMA became kind of, and absolutely no offense intended whatsoever to any MMA fighter, but MMA became kind of a jack of all trades style, where you get pretty good at this, you get pretty good at that, you get pretty good at that. You kind of mix it all together and it works. But it used to be back in the day where you had a guy that was really, really good at one thing. And those were the fun fights to watch back in the day, old school UFC, old school Pride. But I think your contemporary MMA fighter, they're never, ever going to go deep, deep down into a specific style where they're going to learn kind of those weird esoteric stuff that someone who's been very, very devoted to one thing would ever pick up. I'm sorry. No, I was just going to say, in Darren's case, he obviously was probably one of the best grapplers at his weight in the world. So he went deep down the rabbit hole of knowledge and grappling. But obviously he doesn't have the time in the day to devote to learning every martial arts style at that same level. But, I'll, like Musashi said, Miyamoto Musashi, and this is something that I really think a lot of modern day fighters need to contemplate. Musashi said, if you want to get really good at everything, you need to get really good at just one thing. And to me, what that meant was there's a certain process to getting really good at one thing. You have to dedicate yourself to it. You have to just become obsessed by it. And once you've kind of achieved that level, what the practice is, how to get good. Whereas if you only became mediocre at that one thing, you only know what it means to get mediocre at one thing. Therefore, there's nothing else you can do where you're going to get more than mediocre. But if you became really, really, really good at one thing, you can take it something else on, and you kind of know the path of how to get really, really good.
You can actually see that in many things in the world where people who became very high level at something, like maybe let's say they were a pro whatever, and then but when they retire, they become a very successful business person or whatever.
Yeah.
It's very common. It's very common. You can see why. Let me ask you about a few, just your thoughts on a few different things. So
Sure.
just some things that popped in my head. So one thing, you know, you mentioned the part of Japan you were in, they were known for a certain kind of alcohol they produced.
Yeah.
And you know, it's interesting, like in the Japanese culture.
Hang on 1 second.
Yeah.
Not that I necessarily condone the imbibing of alcoholic beverages, but this is, can you see it?
Yeah.
This is Satsuma Godai. So that's the alcohol of that region. And this is Saigo Takamori, who I was telling you about.
Yeah, I remember that.
The guy from The Last Samurai. But it's, you know, it showed you imo, which means potato. That's the sweet potato that grows in that area. But this is what I'm talking about. So I'm sorry, you were going to say.
No problem. I'm glad you brought it. It's a cool bottle too. What I was going to say is, like, the Japanese culture, or at least the Japanese fight culture, it seems like drinking is a part of it. Like, in other words, like, for example, like Carlos Gracie Sr. and Helio Gracie, the two founders of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. I mean, I don't know what was going on in their personal lives, but it appears that they're just like, never drink alcohol ever, like, and don't whatever. But like my karate master, you know, Soshi Oyama, he would take us out and like make us drink. I wasn't a drinker, and he would like kind of he's like, oh, Pita, take a shot. And he'd like, give me a shot. I was like, you know, whatever. I would never do that. I just was not a drinker. I mean, I would have a couple beers back then, but I wasn't like
me neither.
Right. Yeah. And he would like, and he would like, it was like part of the culture, you know? So what are your thoughts on, what do you think about that part of the Japanese culture where it's almost like encouraged? It's almost like in a weird way,
it's mandatory.
Right. It's almost, it's in a weird way, it's like almost part of being healthy to them, like not only physically healthy, but like physically, mentally, and spiritually healthy. You should drink this alcohol, where again, we talked about like some of the original Gracies in the Gracie Jiu-Jitsu lineage. They're like, no, never have it. Don't have a sip of alcohol in your life. What are your thoughts on this whole thing?
Well, okay, first off, going back to what I was saying about, you know, Japan being such a groupistic society, which is probably, I mean, there's not one nationality on this planet that's more groupistic than Japan. That's one thing where if you go out to drink or you go out to eat, you got to do the same as everybody else. You can't, there's no independent spirit, you know, there's no deviation from the group practice. So even if you're not a drinker, if everybody else is drinking, you got to drink. As far as drinking within the martial arts, it's part of samurai culture, and it's just showing that it's kind of a machismo thing. Like, I can drink and it's not going to affect me, and I can still go out and I can still fight and die. No big deal. I mean, do
you think that on a physical level, I mean, I know you're not a nutritionist, but you know about nutrition to a degree. Do you think that like there's just some actual healthy properties of certain alcohol, or do you think like it's really not good for you physically, but it just comes with enough other good stuff that you can do it?
Alcohol is really not good for you. It's actually, it's terrible. Physically on your body. It's not just on your liver, not just on your pancreas, on your brain, on, you know, your digestive system, on your mental outlook, blah, 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 blah. With all that being said, you know, I always make reference to George Burns. How old was George Burns when he passed away?
100 and something, with a cigar in his mouth every day.
Right. So George Burns lived to be 100 and something, legitimately smoked at least one cigar a day. And that, you know, flew in the face of all science. And they've done actually a lot of studies where they've compared, you know, cigarette smokers to cigar smokers to non-smokers. And the numbers, if you don't believe me, look it up. The numbers don't lie. Obviously, cigarette smokers die the first. Then you have the non-smokers, and then it's typically the cigar smokers who live to be the oldest. So you could say, well, maybe it's something about smoking cigars. It makes you tough, or it makes you resilient to disease. I think the reality is that that hour of the day that you spend smoking that cigar, that is 1 hour of relaxation, which can negate any bad stuff that's happened throughout the rest of the day. It's an hour of meditation. It's an hour of self-reflection. It's an hour of no stress. And whatever negatives come from smoking that cigar, the carcinogens or the nicotine or whatever, the benefits of that hour of no stress far outweigh that. And so with that being said, I think there's some similar aspects to alcohol where if within moderation, if within control, it has obviously that same effect where the elimination of stress and the ability to just kind of shut down external noise does have an overall great benefit.
What do you think about the teacher student or guru disciple relationship in martial arts? Specifically, like, it's very interesting. I feel like well, let me start by telling this little story, and then I'll ask the question. Like,
is this about the time you fought the Dutch guys?
No. But I can go back. I can give you a full rendition of that if you want.
Please, I'm sure you will. Please continue.
But actually, I remember when I was reading about my teacher when he was in Japan and he was taking a class like at Masayama's dojo, his teacher. Mm-hmm. And Masayama called him into his office and he's like, "You're going to America and you're going to spread Kyokushin in America. You're going to live there and you're going to die there."
Right.
And my teacher said, and that was that.
Right.
You know, like, so that, I mean, imagine that someone just says to you, "You're going there, you're doing this, you're going to live there and you're going to die there." And you're just like, "Well, that's that. Like, my teacher told me to do it." So there is something very cool about this, like, very hardcore teacher-student relationship. But where does someone, like, there's a certain level where you're like, I'm not going to question anything. I'm not even going to use my own inductive reasoning to even consider what they're saying, because I really am putting myself in their hands for my own benefit too. Or where's the point when you're like, that's what I just heard, not the story I just told you, but maybe you're like, oh, that's actually not good advice. Again, I'm not talking about my teacher or your teacher. I'm just talking about any martial arts teacher where the student is trying to be obedient, but they also want to kind of consider some of the things.
I say there's a very thin line between this very kind of divine, almost religious, relationship between a teacher and a student. There's a very thin line between that and then just a straight up cult and straight up abuse taking place, which is unfortunately what we see a lot, not just in martial arts, but in anything, whether it's a dojo or a gym, a yoga studio, or even a religious group or whatever. There's obviously a lot of abuse of that relationship. Again, going back to your interview with Pettis, he obviously looked at Masayama as, in his own words, as a god on earth. And I think was really how Kyokushin got so big and stayed together for so long. But once Masayama passed away, you had other guys trying to take advantage of those very deep and sincere feelings of the students and the rest of the organization. And at that point, it just became, I'm just going to abuse you and take advantage of you. It's a very personal question you're asking me, because every human being is different. And one person's relationship to their teacher, regardless of what they're doing, is going to be way different. I do think that element exists in martial arts, obviously, and that kind of goes to this kind of generic, kind of magical thing about martial arts. I met my sensei, or I met my sifu, or I met my coach, and we have this, this religious type, connection with each other. If that's real and you believe it's real and it feels real to you, and hopefully you have a good human being on the other end of that, that's great. Unfortunately, that doesn't happen all the time. My best friend, who's from Bosnia originally, it's kind of a weird thing where a lot of people from the ex-Yugoslav states, I wouldn't say it's a weird thing, but they very much look up to Tito nowadays, and they see him as probably the very best leader that they could have been bestowed with. And so my friend, will say that probably the best system of government that works is having a benign dictator. Not a dictator necessarily, but a benign dictator. Someone who truly cares about his people. Someone who rules with an iron fist, who's the buck stops with him, what he says goes, but at the end of the day has his people's best interest in heart. Obviously, we don't always see that with dictators. And I think that that's a very similar situation with a martial arts instructor, where you are at the end of the day kind of running a totalitarian regime. The dojo is, that's your fiefdom. You're the dictator, and your soldiers do what you tell them to do. Hopefully that's a benign dictator, and it's not someone who's just trying to get you to do stuff for their own,
well, actually,
self-benefit.
those are very good points. And I actually, I feel like I observed way back in the day, I'm not going to mention any names, but I feel like I observed some questionable demands on certain fighters by certain whatever. But I had a really cool experience with my teacher, which was I was a fighter for him, and I was training, like you said, like a pro athlete for sure. I was training 7 days a week, 2 hours a day, and all the stuff that went along with that. And at the time, I hurt my knee pretty badly, like pretty bad. And I felt like if I keep doing this, I don't know what's going to happen to my knee. Like it was really hanging by a thread. I mean, thankfully, it's totally healed now. And I went to him and I said, and I was a fighter. I was training in special fighter classes. He was paying for me to go around the world and fight and, whatever. And I went to him and I said, I'm not going to fight anymore. And he said, no, you're going to finish what you started.
No.
And
no.
Yeah. And I actually waited about a week, and I went back to him and I said, look, if I keep fighting, like my knee it could be damaged, whatever I said to him. And he said, okay, you don't have to fight anymore. So and then we were, on great terms and whatever, but it was just an interesting experience because
that made me
said, no, you're fighting actually. I was like, I'm done. He's like, no, actually you're not, as a matter of fact. So
that just made me, think of something that, going back to helping out Darren with, his fighting and cornering and stuff. This is something, if you follow MMA at any level or any capacity, everybody knows this, that fighters get grossly taken advantage of, and they don't get compensated anywhere near what they should, and obviously anywhere near what another professional athlete would make. But these promotions or these promoters or whatever, they figured it out. They figured out the formula with fighters. Fighters are a different species. And if you want to get them to do something that they don't want to do, that the logical part of their brain is like, no, I'm not gonna fight for this ridiculous amount of money, or I'm not gonna fight under these ridiculous conditions. All you have to say is, oh, what are you, a pussy? And then in each fighter's heart, they'll be like, fuck, I'm not a pussy. All right, I'll do it. And that all goes back to the taking advantage of that relationship, where, in some ways the sensei student relationship gets kind of morphs into this promoter fighter relationship in a way, right? And they get you to do stuff that is not good for you. And unfortunately, that only works with fighters. You couldn't get a football player to do that. You couldn't get a soccer player to do any of that. But in a fighter's heart, they always want to be. They want to be a hero. They want to be a samurai. They want to be a fighter. And unfortunately, you can take advantage of that. I remember, Darren and I, we would sit down a couple of times. By this point, he was fighting in UFC. He had fought in Dream. He had fought in Shudo, all the top organizations. We sat down and did the math. At the end of the day, he was literally paying to fight in the UFC. And it's just like, what the fucking shit, dude? And they get away with it. So I don't know if you see the connection I'm trying to make between your point of that sensei student relationship.
I do, yeah.
But
I do totally. No, it's an excellent point. Anyway, I've thought about that a lot over the years. Not how it's affected me, because I'm out of that already.
Right.
But I've just thought about a lot about this idea of like you said, one thing you said a few minutes ago was very important. Hopefully the sensei or the teacher or whoever he is or she is a good person, a good human being on that end,
Right.
Because, and they could still be wrong. They can still have misjudgment, but at least it's a good foundation when
Coming
they're
from
a
a
good
good place,
person,
yeah.
right? Or whatever that means, to them or whoever is thinking about it, and that they're doing their best to help the person. And that's at least a good start, because like you said, there's all kinds of roads that can be gone down with that scenario. But anyway.
Yeah.
All right, man, that was a great interview. I'm glad that
Thank
we
you.
did it. And I think a lot of people will benefit from watching it, whether they're a martial artist or not, because there's a lot of principles that were brought up, like the Musashi stuff and a lot of other things that were said that anyone can learn from. And of course, any martial artist would, of course, enjoy it. So thank you. I appreciate it.
When I heard that there's this guy named Joe Rogan who's trying to copy your concept of a podcast, I was just taken aback, and I had to make an appearance so that we can right the wrongs.
Well, listen, I know Rogan's been trying to get you on for years, and the fact that you came,
keep calling, Joe. Keep calling.
The fact that you came to mind first, I appreciate it.
You got it.